Settlers. Chapter 13, Section 1. The Philistine Mode of Life. Most importantly, Euro-Americans share an exceptional way of life. What is so exceptional about it is that almost all get to live in a bourgeois way, quote, quite Philistine in the mode of life, in the size of their earnings, and in their entire outlook, end of quote. Thus, the mass of the lower middle classes, the huge labor aristocracy, and most workers are fused together by a common national way of life and a common national ideology as oppressors. The masses share a way of life that apes the bourgeoisie, dominated by a decadent preoccupation with private consumption. Consuming things and owning things, no matter how shoddy or trivial, is the mass religion. The real world of desperate toil, the world of the proletarians who own nothing but their labor power, is looked down upon with contempt and fear by Euro-Americans. Euro-Americans know how privileged they have it on a world scale, how exceptional they are. Interviews by one reporter in an Iowa industrial city found, quote, the prevailing attitude expressed here was capsuled in this comment from Don Schatzberg, the 46-year-old foreman of a concrete pipe plant. Beginning of quote. If you had a chance to pick your country, where else would you go? Where else can a working man own his own house and 2 cars and take a vacation every year? I'd say I'm a happy man, not a bit unhappy with my lifestyle, end quote. Like Mr. Schatzberg and many other Americans elsewhere, workers here often seemed to equate success with ownership of homes, cars, campers, boats, and the like. I work a lot of hours, said James Dirks, Teamster Union shop steward at Seidler. But I've got a car, a truck, a boat, and a camper to show for it. And Levon Feldpouch, a 36-year-old wife and mother who works as a clerk for Deere, where her husband is also employed, said, quote, I feel my life is in an upward curve. She noted that she and her husband had accumulated 3 houses and added, we're not going to stop there. They also own 2 cars, a truck, a boat, and a motorcycle, and take 2 vacation trips a year, one with their children and one without. End of long quote. All statistics show that the amount of consumption in Euro-American society is staggering. Enough so that it establishes for the mass a certain culture. In the settler tradition, today's Euro-American culture is one of homeowning, with 68.4% of all settler households in 1979 owning their own home, up 50% from 1940. These households share a cornucopia of private electric appliances. 89.8% of all U.S. homes in 1979 had color TVs, watched an average of over 6 hours per day. 55% had air conditioning. 77.3% had washing machines, and 61% had clothes dryers. 43% had dishwashers. 52% had blenders and food processors, and so on. Much of the world's health products are hoarded in the US, with, for example, 1 out of every 3 pairs of prescription eyeglasses in the world sold here. In terms of the, quote, basics, the most characteristic for Euro-Americans is the automobile. In 1980, there were a total of 104.6 million cars on the road. 84.1% of all U.S. households had cars, with 36.6% having two or more. Everyone says that owning automobiles is a, quote, necessity, without which transportation to work, 83% drive to work, shopping and childcare cannot be done. A Bureau of Labor Statistics study shows how the, quote, average wage owner in Boston of 1875 had to spend 94% of the family income on necessities: food, clothing, and housing. A, quote, century of progress to the good life later. The study found that the average wage earner in 1972 to 73 in Boston spent only 62% on these necessities, meaning they, quote, could afford to spend 38% on non-essentials, end quote. We should note that few Euro-Americans would agree with this elemental definition, since in their society such things as automobiles, sleeping pills, college education, dry cleaning, telephones, etc. are viewed as, quote, necessities. These by no means exhaust the list of Euro-American private possessions. Stocks. 1 out of every 7 Euro-Americans owns at least some corporate stocks. Vacation homes, land, hair dryers, motorcycles, exercise equipment, guns, boats, annual changes of clothing styles, and on and on. We have brought up these boring, almost mind-numbing lists of possessions to drive home the point that consuming is a disease among settlers, an infection that is dominant in that culture. Euro-American life is no longer centered around production, but around consumption. This is the near final stage of decadence. All this is only made possible by the generalized high income that characterizes Euro-American mass life. The median Euro-American family income in 1981 was $23,517. This is not equally distributed, quite obviously, but the extent to which many Euro-Americans in all classes, an absolute majority, shared this generalized high income is striking. Between 1960 and 1979, the percentage of settler families earning over $25,000 per year in constant 1979 dollars doubled, making up 40% of the settler population. When we examine Euro-American families earning over $20,000 per year in terms of different occupations, this income sameness is very conspicuous. A chart of family income by husband's occupation. On the left side is husband's occupation, on the right side is percent earning over $20,000 in 1978 dollars. Manager, 75%. Professional, 67%. Clerical sales, 69%. Skilled worker, 49%. Unskilled worker, 35%. This generalized high income has come to characterize even industrial production workers, who in previous historical periods were highly exploited and lived in abject misery. An upper stratum of unionized production workers in heavy industry earn on an approximate level with the petty bourgeoisie. At the end of 1982, General Motors was paying its blue-collar workers an average base wage of $11.53 per hour, plus an additional 99 cents per hour in shift and overtime premiums, and an additional $7.13 per hour in average benefits, such as health insurance, SUB, holiday and vacation pay, etc. This is a total package of some $40,000 per year. Steelworkers' average 1981 total wage package was $19.42 an hour. This compares to craft incomes in the most fortunate high-wage areas. In San Jose, California, the latest pact raises union electricians' total wage to $24.40 an hour. Most Euro-American workers no longer can go into such industries, however. Much more typical and more exploited would be Maureen Akin, recently written about as one of the 9,000 Motorola workers in Phoenix, Arizona. A 41-year-old divorcee, Miss Akin earns $7.02 per hour for a 36-hour work week as a production worker making semiconductors. Living on a restricted budget, she saw only one movie last year in order to pay for her son's orthodontic work and her daughter's college. When we go down even lower, we find the notoriously low-wage North Carolina textile mills, which, in a low-wage industry, have the poorest paid workers of those in any state. Virtual symbols of backward, quote, poor white exploitation. They paid an average production wage in 1982 of $5.24 per hour, or $10,900 per year. This low wage of North Carolina textile mill workers is much higher than world standards. This is roughly 30 times the wage that the Del Monte division of the R.J. Reynolds Corporation pays the women workers who toil 10 to 12 hours each day on their vast Philippine plantations. It is 11.5 times the wage that Rawling Company pays the Haitian women who stitch together all the Major League Baseballs. It is 5 times the wage that General Motors pays its African auto workers in Azania. The most exploited Euro-American workers live whole levels above the standard of the world proletariat, since they may be on the bottom, but they are on the bottom of a privileged nation of oppressors. Nation is the dominant factor modifying class relations. No matter where we look, the mass extra-proletarian privileges of Euro-American No matter where we look, the mass extra-proletarian privileges of Euro-Americans have structurally insulated them within their exceptional way of life. Quote, problems, like high mortgage rates for homes, are problems of a particular way of life. The full extent of what the Euro-American masses get from their special relationship serving imperialism cannot be measured in dollars alone. Everyone in the empire understands the saying, quote, if you're white, you're all right. To the settler garrison goes the first pick of whatever is available: homes, jobs, schools, food, health care, government services, and so on. Whatever security is available under imperialism is theirs as well. This is taken for granted. A 1977 survey by the Center for Policy Research among Vietnam veterans in the Northeast showed that while African Vietnam-era vets surveyed had an unemployment rate of 28%, corresponding Euro-American veterans had an unemployment rate of only 3%. Further, the employed Euro-American veterans earned an average of $4,212 more per year than even those African veterans who were working. Even the women's movement became a real factor in preserving their exceptional way of life. While the women's movement both expressed anger at sexism and greatly improved Euro-American women's lives, it was largely co-opted as a political movement by imperialism at its birth. The imperialist-sponsored, quote, liberation of settler women has been a major prop to reinforce and modernize the patriarchal family structure. For that matter, to transfuse the whole settler society. Just as the empire called out white women from the kitchen during World War II to be, quote, Rose the Riveter in war industry, so in the 1970s, white women were again freed by imperialism to enter the labor force into new areas and in unprecedented numbers. First, at a time when the empire had decided that Africans were again too rebellious to be employed in any great numbers in key industrial, commercial, and professional institutions, Euro-American women were recruited to stand by their men in filling up the jobs. Quote, equal opportunity in medical schools, law schools, business, etc., meant a large influx of Euro-American women, and few Africans. This is noticeable even in the blue-collar skilled trades, which have long been male sectors of employment. During 1970 to 80, the percentage of women in these restricted crafts rose at a rate 3 times that for Third World workers. This was like a new wave of European immigration to reinforce the settler hold on their job market. And it was a, quote, breath of fresh air, modernizing settler society. Now, for instance, even the New York Times has a very literary, quote, women's consciousness column called Hers, where feminist leaders and writers can reach a mass audience. The fractures of the 60s are being reconciled and reunited among settlers. Novelist Gail Sheehy wrote in this column, quote, behind just about every successful woman I know with a public as well as a private life, there is another woman. The dirty little secret is, all but one of the female leaders interviewed here has household help. End quote. Sheehy herself tried Filipino and Argentinian domestics unsuccessfully, too, quote, hostile, before going back to the tried and true African woman domestic. While women's liberation is an essential part of the world revolutionary future, the struggles of women in various societies have their own national characteristics. In the U.S. oppressor nation, the politics of women's liberation form but one small current within the much larger overall women's movement. This larger movement is pro-imperialist and is concerned only with the equality of privilege among male and female settlers. It is opposed to any liberation in general. The revolutionary ideas of women's liberation rested lightly upon the surface of the women's movement, and some individual women did pick them up. Real wages in the U.S. began to stagnate in 1967, when imperialism ran aground on the Vietnamese Revolution. For the first time since World War II, rapid inflation was eating at the upward spiral of Euro-American income. In this continuing crisis, the new income of Euro-American women saved the settler family from, quote, loss of buying power, a phrase of the oppressor nation economy that carries an almost traumatic weight. The new income of employed women contributed to the 22% increase in real per capita income in the U.S. between 1970 and 80. The Euro-American family continued its way of life by becoming a two-wage earner family, at a time when African proletarian families, for example, were increasingly becoming the reverse. By 1978, some 75% of the U.S. families with incomes over $25,000 per year had two wage earners. The New York Times reported, quote, "Across the nation, women have swarmed into the workforce by the millions, swelling the numbers of multi-income families. That trend can mask the effects of inflation, since a substantial number of families are living better than they did." End quote. We are not just describing simple social bribery, as in the bourgeoisification of European workers in Germany, France, England, etc. In Europe, the bribed workers came from a long history of class war, in societies with centuries of sharply defined and rigid class divisions. Their classes, however bribed and infected, still exist as formations in the actual social world, occupying traditional communities, continuing a definite class culture. Politically, the European working class still swell the large, nominally, quote, socialist, voluntary industrial unions, which do not exist in the U.S. oppressor nation, and are electorally represented by their traditional working class parties, the German Social Democratic Party, the French Communist Party, etc. Of course, the long-range trends of world polarization and internationalization mean that all oppressor nation societies have become more alike, and will become even more so. In America, this bribery, this bourgeoisification, took place within the context of a settler society, which has its own history, culture, and traditions, based not on class struggle, but on their material role as the privileged garrison over the continental empire. The immigrant European proletarians were bribed by being absorbed, i.e., integrated, if you will, into this specific society. Some pictures of militant murals in East Los Angeles. Strident voices from some quarters have grown larger. So, in America, intra-oppressor class distinctions have always been muted on the mass level by the fact that the main distinction was whether you were a settler or a subject, whether you were in the slave patrols or enslaved in the fields, whether you were in the frontier garrison community or imprisoned in the reservation. This was the all-important identity to which everything else was subordinate. Only someone with no contact with reality can fail to see this. End of section 1.